In the dying days of World War II, the Nazis hid millions of dollars worth of looted gold. What happened to that gold remains one of the greatest mysteries of the war.
In the final months of World War II, as cities burned and borders collapsed, something else was quietly set in motion. The wealth of the Third Reich did not disappear with defeat. It was moved, hidden, traded, and transformed, leaving behind a trail that would take decades to understand. The wealth of a dying regime. By early 1945, the Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival, and behind that final struggle stood an enormous accumulation of wealth built through occupation, coercion, and systematic theft across Europe. This was not simply gold stored in vaults. It was a financial system, national reserves seized from occupied countries, foreign currencies stripped from central banks, and valuables taken from persecuted civilians had all been absorbed into the Reich's economy. At its center stood the Reichsbank in Berlin, which had become far more than a national institution. It functioned as the administrative core of Nazi plunder. Once assets entered this system, they were processed and recorded until their origins disappeared. Gold lost its provenance, currency lost its history. What had been taken by force could be made to appear legitimate. That transformation gave the regime flexibility and allowed it to continue operating even as defeat became inevitable. But by 1945, the priority had shifted. The question was no longer how to accumulate wealth, but how to preserve it. Allied forces advanced from the west, Soviet troops closed in from the east, and Berlin itself became increasingly vulnerable. The Reich's financial center was now exposed. Leadership faced a new reality. If the system collapsed, so would the wealth it controlled. That urgency redefined these assets. Gold, currency, and records were no longer passive reserves. They became strategic cargo, tied not just to the war's final phase, but to whatever might exist afterward. Preserving wealth meant preserving future leverage. That shift set the stage for a decisive operation. Berlin under fire, the Reichsbank evacuation. On February 3, 1945, the illusion of security in Berlin ended. American bombers struck the capital's administrative core, damaging ministries, infrastructure, and financial institutions critical to the regime. The Reichsbank headquarters was hit. Sections of the building were destroyed, operations disrupted, and staff forced underground as debris filled the corridors. Although the vaults survived, the message was clear. Berlin could no longer protect the Reich's wealth. The response was immediate. Administrative functions were relocated to cities like Weimar and Erfurt. More importantly, plans were made to move the physical reserves themselves. This required a location that could survive air raids, conceal large quantities of material, and remain operational as Germany collapsed. The solution lay underground. The Kaiserroda potash mine near Merkers in Thuringia offered exactly that. Deep beneath layers of rock and far from major bombing targets, it provided concealment that Berlin no longer could. Convoys began leaving the capital. They carried currency, foreign reserves, financial records, and eventually vast quantities of gold. Despite the chaos of a collapsing transport system, the operation retained structure. Even in defeat, the system attempted control. For a brief moment, it worked. The Reich's financial core had been removed from immediate danger and hidden deep within the earth. But time was running out. Merkers, the hidden treasury. The shipments to Merkers represented the last concentrated form of Nazi economic power. The mine, never intended as a vault, became one through necessity. Cargo was unloaded with precision. Nearly 1,000 sacks of Reichsmarks arrived first, followed by foreign currencies, including millions of US dollars. Then came the most valuable shipment, roughly 100 tons of gold. Stored in sealed containers deep within secured chambers, much of it was placed behind reinforced barriers in what became known as Chamber 8. Alongside official reserves were coins from across Europe, industrial silver, and records tied to the regime's looting operations. This was not a temporary measure. It was an attempt to preserve wealth beyond the collapse of the state itself. For weeks, the system held. The mine remained hidden, its contents known only to a limited circle. Compared to Berlin's destruction, Merkers offered a sense of control, but that control depended on one assumption, that Germany still had time. By late March 1945, that assumption collapsed. Allied forces advanced faster than expected. When the Third Army under George S. Patton pushed into central Germany, the distance between the front and the mine rapidly disappeared. By early April, evacuation was no longer feasible. Rail systems were failing, roads were under pressure, and the sheer weight of the gold made rapid movement impossible. When American troops entered the mine, they uncovered a vast underground treasury. Not rumor, not speculation, but the financial remains of a collapsing regime. Yet the discovery raised a critical question. If so much had been hidden here, how much had already been moved elsewhere? The legend of the Silesian gold train. The Merkers' discovery confirmed that Nazi wealth had been hidden on a massive scale, but it also fueled speculation that other caches had vanished. In Silesia, that speculation evolved into legend. As Soviet forces advanced in late 1944, German authorities evacuated civilians, archives, and valuables from the region. Among the stories that emerged was one of a train leaving Breslau, loaded with gold and documents that disappeared before reaching safety. The terrain made the story plausible. Around Wałbrzych, the region was filled with tunnels, mines, and underground structures linked to Project Reese, one of the regime's most secret construction efforts. Over time, missing records and fragmented testimony allowed the story to grow. Some claimed the train had been diverted and sealed inside a tunnel before Soviet forces arrived. In 2015, the legend resurfaced when researchers reported ground-penetrating radar anomalies suggesting a buried train. Media attention surged, and for a moment, the myth seemed close to confirmation. But detailed surveys told a different story. The anomalies were geological. No train was found. The failure forced a reassessment. Perhaps the disappearance of Nazi wealth was not primarily about hidden tunnels. Perhaps it had occurred in a far less visible way. Canfranc and the route that worked. While legends captured public imagination, a far more effective system operated in plain sight. Between 1942 and 1944, the railway station at Canfranc International Railway Station became a critical corridor linking occupied Europe with neutral states. Through this route, gold moved with bureaucratic efficiency. Records later showed that significant quantities passed through Switzerland, were processed, and arrived at Canfranc before entering Spain. By then, the gold had often been melted and recast, stripped of identifying features, and documented as legitimate bullion. Once across the border, part of it moved into Portugal, while part entered Spain's financial system. In exchange, neutral states supplied Germany with materials like tungsten, essential for armaments. What made this system effective was not secrecy alone, but legality. Transactions were processed, documented, and accepted by institutions. In that process, plunder became currency. This redefined disappearance. Wealth did not need to be hidden if it could be normalized. Amorin and fragmented loot. Not all wealth moved through organized systems. As German control fractured, some assets became decentralized and improvised. In the Netherlands, during the fighting around Operation Market Garden, a bank in Arnhem was damaged. German soldiers reportedly removed valuables, including jewelry, coins, and small gold bars. Without formal documentation, the cash was transported to the village of Amorin and buried using natural landmarks as reference points. After the war, testimony led to a hand-drawn map. A search in 1947 found nothing, and the case faded. In 2023, the map was released, triggering renewed interest. A modern excavation followed. Again, nothing was found. The case revealed a different pattern. Not all wealth had been carefully hidden. Some was buried hastily, poorly documented, and ultimately lost, recovered privately, or erased by time. The real disappearance. By the end of the war, the key question was no longer where the gold had gone, but what it had become. After 1945, Allied authorities attempted recovery through restitution programs. In theory, the goal was simple. In practice, it was nearly impossible. Much of the gold had been melted, recast, and merged into reserves. Once inside financial systems, it became indistinguishable. Institutions measured gold by weight and purity, not origin. At the same time, political priorities shifted. Europe required reconstruction and stability. In that environment, unresolved claims were often delayed or narrowed. Privately stolen assets frequently fell outside recovery frameworks. Over time, recovery gave way to normalization. Gold taken through violence entered national reserves, supported trade, and became part of the post-war economy. Institutions like the Tripartite Gold Commission continued working until 1998, more than 50 years after the war ended. Even then, many questions remained unresolved. Later investigations into banking networks confirmed the deeper truth. A significant portion of Nazi wealth had not been hidden. It had been processed, circulated, and legitimized. That is what made its disappearance so effective. In the end, the gold did not vanish. It changed form. It moved from plunder into reserves, from theft into transaction, from evidence into asset. What disappeared was not the wealth itself, but the visible link between that wealth and the crimes that created it. And that may be the most unsettling conclusion. The greatest concealment was not underground. It occurred within systems capable of preserving value while erasing history, allowing the financial shadow of a dying regime to outlive the regime itself.